I'm here with David A. Davis, and he's the Eudora Welty Prize winner, and he's the author of World War I and Southern Modernism. Welcome to Columbus and the Eudora Welty Symposium, David.
Thank you, Steve. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Good. Now, your book does something special in that many books previous to it treated Southern writing as if only William Faulkner had apprehended the impact of World War I and modernism. You break so many books open for the reader. Was that entirely your goal? When did you come onto the idea that, well, wait, that's not the whole picture of Southern writing and modernism?
Very good point. Part of my objective in this book is to explain one of the really persistent problems in the study of Southern literature. Namely, where did all these Southern writers in the 1920s and 1930s come from? Often Faulkner has been treated as his own individualistic case study. But the more prevailing theory has been that these Southern writers just sprang sui generis from the earth. That there was this embedded narrative that just suddenly rushed forward, and it's been called the Southern Renaissance. I'm not really satisfied with that idea. That doesn't seem very persuasive to me. I think there's something going on that opens up the floodgates of writing in the 20s and 30s by Southern writers. And so I attempted to understand what is going on, how Southern writers come into contact with the work of modernism, and how modernist literature plays out in the work of Southern writers. And a little bit of deductive reasoning indicates that there is one event that happens contemporaneous with this time period that affects dozens and dozens of writers, that brings Southerners on a large scale into contact with people from outside the South, that puts artists and intellectuals in contact with the avant-garde ideas of modernism. And, well, that event is World War I.
World War I. Now, you talk about two kinds of modernity, and I found it really interesting to trace that. The South, for the most part, had what you call distal modernity, meaning that it was not in the proximal places like Paris and New York and other places where all kinds of art was springing up. But what was the difference really between distance learned modernity, if you will, or modernity that you elegantly say radiated into the South? What was the difference between that and proximal?
Thank you for asking about that. That's the core theory in the book, the idea that modernity radiates outward from centers. So by the middle of the 19th century, a few specific locations on Earth had developed entirely different ways of living, what we call modernity. So these are urbanized spaces, with industrialized economies, with high levels of education, with generally progressive politics. And these places are Vienna, Berlin, Paris, London, a little bit later New York, Boston, and eventually Chicago in the United States around the early 20th century. So life in these locations is substantially different than life in the more traditionally agricultural, ruralized spaces that had, up till that point, dominated the landscape of the earth. So there's a different way of living, and we see a consistently different form of artistic production that's coming out of these particular zones. So those zones I call proximal sites of modernity. Those are modernized spaces that are producing modernist work. It's also highly significant in my mind that the four European centers that I mentioned just a moment ago, those are the two sides of World War I. So Vienna and Berlin on one side, Paris and London on the other.
Exactly.
So World War I is itself a marker of modernity. Well, what happens to those spaces that aren't yet modernized, that are coming in contact with modern spaces? And what happens to the artists and intellectuals who are moving from one space to another? I think that the influences radiate outward, and they radiate at varying levels of intensity. I use the analogy of a rock thrown into a puddle and watching the ripples move outward. So what we see in the South is modernism without modernity. We're seeing there the ripple effect of modernization playing out in a place that has not yet, but is slowly beginning to modernize. And we see the work of writers and artists and intellectuals who've been exposed to modernity, many by virtue of their experience in World War I and their travel across the Atlantic, writing about these spaces that still aren't yet modern, but they can apprehend the coming of modernization. Faulkner, of course, is the poster boy for this process, but he's not acting alone. And so my objective here is to put him in context with his milieu and dozens of other writers who are showing many of the same effects in their work.
One of the brilliant things that you do within the book is that you break open African American writers who either served in World War I or were exposed to modernity through not direct service in the trenches, but the awful menial labor that they were assigned, even though they were drafted and willing to serve their country. Talk about some of those writers and the ways in which, as I read that chapter, I almost felt as if the black modernists were practicing the most radical expression of change and change now as they were writing. So you've introduced us to Victor R. Daley and Claude McKay. What did you find about those African American writers that most intrigued you about their encounter with World War I?
So for African American writers, World War I was a highly revolutionary moment. The war comes at what has been called the nadir of African American life, when Jim Crow is very fully in effect. And the war offers the prospect, the possibility, however unlikely it would be in retrospect, that African Americans could use this opportunity as a vehicle to civil rights.
Like Du Bois wrote about.
Exactly. This is the wager that Du Bois makes in his editorial Close Ranks. Let us now forget our grievances with the white man and stand shoulder by shoulder in ranks together against a common enemy. And the hope was this would lead to voting rights and civil rights and social equality. That, of course, doesn't happen. So for African Americans, the war is often even more violent and even more complicated on the home front afterward than it is in their experience in France. In France, many African Americans who have the opportunity to serve actually experienced a modicum of social equality among the French people. And then come back to the United States and find that there's going to be no equality extended. So we see immediately after the war, the Red Summer of 1919, which is a series of riots nationwide, where white people are enforcing their privilege violently on African Americans, but African Americans are fighting back. Victor R. Daley, for me, is a fascinating writer. He's a great embodiment of the story of African Americans in World War I. He's a writer originally from New York, but he enlists and he is trained as an officer, and to be an African American trained as an officer is a highly significant cultural achievement. He serves in the war, he wins the Croix de Guerre for his bravery in combat, and then afterwards he works in the African American social and political movement. And then in 1932 he writes a novel about the experience of African Americans in the war that's set first in the South and then later in Europe. And it's a really fascinating barometer for me of the experience of African Americans in the war. And it's significant that he is the only African American veteran who wrote a novel specifically set in the context of World War I. So thus it's a highly illustrative text.
Another aspect of Southern literature that you break open in the book that was really exciting to me was the new Southern woman and those writers who, in essence, created and introduced and gave her full flourish. And Frances Newman and Zelda Fitzgerald. Did Frances Newman actually know that that's what she was doing?
Well, I couldn't answer for Frances Newman. I can tell you that her work is fascinating and perplexing. But the work of women writers for me is important because if we go back to thinking about that ripple effect, well, I think the ripples are more intense for the individuals who actually have contact with modernity and go to Europe, who see some degree of combat. but we can see the real effect of the ripples radiating outward by their effect on domestic spaces during the war. And I argue that it's that domestic ripple that is probably most significant. It's in the work of women writers, most of whom were still in the United States during the war, who were getting involved in the war effort, that have the most significant impact. So we see during the war that women in a very highly patriarchal society in the South are taking on social, economic, and political roles in ways that they had not since, well, the previous war, the Civil War. And it also is very significant that this engagement by women in the political sphere leads very quickly to the suffrage amendment being passed, and women earning the right to vote, which is extremely controversial in the South, but it's an impact that's unavoidable. And so placing the experience of women in this context demonstrates exactly how profound the radiating effect of modernity actually is.
Out of all of the literature that you surveyed to understand this, what is the one, I hate to put the adjective lost novel in front of something, lost is kind of silly when you can access it, but that is lost to our consciousness, that we're not paying attention to, that we're not reading, the one book that you said, this is a gem, why didn't I know about this?
Oh gosh. There are a number of candidates for that. Paul Green's play, Johnny Johnson, is a really fascinating text, and I would love to see that recovered and restaged, especially now that we're in the centennial of the war. Zelda Fitzgerald's novel, Save Me the Waltz, is so highly underrated. It's a beautiful, lyrical, frustrating text, and it's so much Zelda's story. And for anyone who is interested in modernism, particularly the works of Scott Fitzgerald, it's really essential to read her story as well. The works of the African American writers, I think, collectively really deserve more significant attention. I talk about Walter Wright's novel, Fire and Flint, but to me the one that's most important is Victor R. Daley's novel, Not Only War, which had been entirely out of print and had not received an awful lot of notice. And in the course of doing my research, I discovered it's definitely not the right word, but I went back to that text that had been lost for, well, lost is a pejorative term perhaps, a text that had not received significant attention for several decades, and was able to also republish the text. So it's now in print again, and I'm happy to say that it's getting a good bit of critical and scholarly attention. So it's been mentioned in a few other books about World War I and the subject of a couple of essays. So I'm very pleased to see that text in particular getting some attention.
That's a good feeling. So that's Victor R. Daley's Not Only War, that's back in print. Oh, that's wonderful. One of the difficult, thorny things to work into this, and I thought you did quite a job with it, was what to do with the agrarians, almost the recalcitrant, reactionary thing. No matter what you're going to change, there's one of those fussing about it. How does that very powerful set of white Nashville-based powerhouses, how does that work into the picture of Southern modernism?
Right. Well, that particular group of individuals has more to do with how Southern literature has been conceptualized than any other group because of their effect on the structure of America's literary critical history. And they are primarily responsible for the theory of the Southern Renaissance, the notion that Southern literature springs from the wellspring of the Southern soil, which is not true. And in fact, their experience is illustrative of how modernity radiates. John Ransom, who's the center of the agrarian movement and the Archduke of New Criticism, serves in World War I and begins writing poetry very much in the vein of World War I trench poetry. He's very influenced in particular by Edmund Blunden. Donald Davidson, another stalwart of the agrarian movement, also serves in World War I. And he wrote in The Southern Writer in the Modern World, which was the very first volume of the Lamar Lectures held at Mercer University.
Very good.
He writes extensively about his experience in World War I and about how he, as a Southerner, had a crisis of conscience as a person who identified with the South over the North, meaning the United States, amalgamating into an army of Americans and his sense of identity destabilization. Well, I argued that what eventually becomes the Southern agrarian movement is, in a sense, a backlash against the radiation of modernity into the movement. It's just unfortunate that that backlash overtook the process of radiation, so I think we kind of lost the broader context as we focused on the small set of writers that the agrarians put forward as representatives of the Southern experience. We lost the broader context, and so thinking about these ideas more broadly illustrates how effective they are to a larger set of people.
Another exciting thing that you did within the book, I thought, was to talk about how each of these three parts that we've just talked about intersected, but also, in essence, sort of refracted or pushed back against some of those radiating ripples. I was fascinated and saddened to see that the agrarians reviewed Ellen Glasgow's Barren Ground,
Right.
and hated it because there were tractors in it. Right?
Right, yes.
So you've done just a splendid thing for Southern literature and for our understanding of modernism. I'm so glad you could come to Columbus and talk with us, David. This has been great.
Thank you very much, Steve.
Absolutely.